So welcome, everyone. I'm here today with Thomas Rasmussen, and I'm excited to have Thomas because he's at the intersection of marketing and finance. And this is a perennial question, typically marketing or sales in general, is how do we connect the value creation elements of pipeline marketing activities and sales, which seems to be a lot harder on the top line than it is on the bottom line. So I'm glad to have Thomas. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Thanks for having me. So yeah, I mean, as you said, my name is Thomas Rasmussen. I'm from Denmark, but I live in Gibraltar, which is a British overseas territory attached to the southern part of Spain. And as you say, the headline of what I do is essentially connecting marketing with finance and the other way around. So kind of helping the CMO answer the questions of the CFO. And I do this in a company called Betson Group, which is a large European online gambling operator, meaning we run a portfolio of brands that operate in the online sports betting and online casino space predominantly across a wide range of jurisdictions. So I kind of have two day jobs right now, actually. One is to look at the marketing investment portfolio, the long-term returns on the bottom line for that, kind of translating my insights from how marketing works in terms of branding and more short-term activation in how do you really translate that into discounted cash flows, net present values and what have you. Customer lifetime value is obviously also a component of that. And our industry is pretty used to this terminology, actually. We have an abundance of data on this. The other thing I do is I do business development in the US. I've been heading this up for a group for a little while now, as that's a rapidly developing market. And I've been in this industry for 14 years, I want to say. I joined another major operator in 2006 when I moved down here. I've worked with global CRM operations, which I ran. I ran a regional business unit for the Nordics that had a bit more emphasis on customer acquisition. And then as I really wanted to answer this question, like what is it exactly that happens with your marketing spend? That seemed to be a lot easier to answer when you did CRM. Push the button and a million emails go out to a bunch of customers. We see them take promos and bonuses and what have you. And then when I started going broader than that and doing more traditional advertising, as an example, that became a much more difficult question to answer. So I became really curious about like how on earth does the CMO actually answer the question from the CFO? What happens if I take half of your budget? And then I ran the function for marketing analytics. I did consumer research. And now, look back, I really kind of connect the full spectrum of this. And you could, by the way, say your headline is digital disruption, I suppose. And if anything, our whole industry has been the kind of digital disruptor component of the wider gambling sector for a couple of decades, destination resort casinos, lotteries and what have you. So we're kind of the digital invader, if you will.
One of the things I remember from business school, they told us, 50% of marketing spend is wasted. We just don't know which 50%. That's the old adage, right? And you're trying to untangle that and figuring out where is marketing attribution relevant and where it creates value. So you have sort of an insight based on your experience of where to look for marketing value. Is there a clear line or is still a murky space?
It's still kind of a black box that I found really interesting to try to understand more. But there's a bunch of really smart people on this. I follow a lot the work of Byron Sharp is another one. You have Peter Field and Les Binet have done fantastic work on this. I kind of follow their categorization of there's kind of a spectrum of branding to activation, that in order to influence purchase behavior in a large amount of people, branding really has something to say. And branding is a much less tangible activity, meaning there's a large lack of action to outcome. They really play together, and you have to understand the long term of it. And I would argue, even though there are great methods, econometrics, multiple regression analysis. When you have multiple years of data, there are methods to kind of weed this out. But I argue you kind of have to be comfortable never really knowing exactly, how many TV ad impressions or how many times did you see the name of a stadium, how many times did that take for you to make that purchase in the end. So all the media on the spectrum, they play a role, but you need to understand what role they exactly play. And so when I'm a bit, again, I'm not anti-digital marketing, it just happens to be that digital advertising is a bit more in the activation spectrum. And as such, there's a danger that you can become myopic and, you make decisions on what you can measure. So let's say the theoretical situation is that you go, wow, it's super cheap. The customers we acquire through Google PPC. So let's put all our advertising budget on that then, because we don't really know what the sponsorship did. So that will then eventually mean that you don't really have a demand. You don't really know what happened like a year or two later. No one is actually typing in your brand or typing in your your category. So the danger is that if you put too much emphasis on this, you may be making the slightly wrong decisions on what you can measure right away, and you become quite short-sighted. So it's really about finding the balance. Is kind of my overall point. And no one needs to sell the stuff that everyone can measure. So sometimes I'm kind of dialing the other way. Well, don't forget the other stuff. It actually does something as well. And then there are various ways you can kind of get into how do you estimate, how many eyeballs do you know that it sees, and so these ads are exposed to, and so on and so forth. So my viewpoint is that you should definitely take your digital advertising activities very seriously. You have to optimize them and get on it. Maybe don't overcomplicate it, and don't get sucked into too much fashion. And don't forget that some of the old stuff actually still plays a role as long as anyone is looking at it.
So partially what you're saying is because digital is easy to measure. There's a lot of data. People tend to skew towards digital as the answer, whereas it's harder to evaluate some other advertising options or marketing options could yield similar benefits. Is that correct?
In a sense, yes. And actually, I think that's kind of a wider conversation that I think is healthy to have as well. Is that I'm in an industry that has immense amounts of data. That's definitely not our issue. It's more about finding out what's the right data to look at. So I'm kind of putting it a bit over in that bucket that great, you can generate a lot of data, but you actually need quite a lot of experience, organizational experience, to know what are the right sets of data to look at. And by the way, another thing that I kind of talk a lot about is make sure that you both look at identify which metrics you need to look at, which frequencies. You do your brand tracking. Maybe I would argue you might be, depending on your category, maybe you do that once a year. You check your PPC once a day. Whatever it is, you check your server uptime. You better have people on that by the second, at least in our industry, because we can definitely count exactly how many dollars we're losing every minute we're down. But don't look at your brand tracking every minute, because that simply doesn't move that fast.
Let me ask you a question about the intersection between your role and the finance role. And you happen to be that intersection, because that's fascinating to me. So what are the kinds of conversations you have? Or how educated do you think, not necessarily in your company because you do have this role, but many companies really have these silos between finance and marketing. The CFO and the CMO really don't talk too much. What kind of best practices are out there in terms of connecting these two pillars?
And first, actually, I would argue you should start by defining what marketing exactly is. We all know that marketing is pretty much everything that it takes from someone makes a raw innovation in an organization, and then it's up to the strategic marketer and the various support people in the marketing department to monetize that raw innovation. How do you get the CMO to talk to the CFO? Well, I think get together and agree what are your what's your fiduciary duty to your shareholders? The CEO should be the tiebreaker in this, right? But what is our purpose? Well, there can be lots of levels of purpose, but definitely one of them is shareholder value generation. And so at some point, your investments have to come back. Now, then talk about, well, what are your lead indicators for this? Is it the numbers of new customers we got in? Is it how many you're retaining? Is it the forecasted customer lifetime value of your customers? Can you see kind of your customer cohort health? Do you have some numbers on this? And maybe justify. And then I'll go back to where does the digital advertising component. I would argue probably a lot of finance people will skew a bit more towards that because they're like, this is very tangible. We like this. And that's where I would argue the marketers have to really make their case for what exactly is it branding does, and how do you plan for it. I mean, nothing is guaranteed in this world, but why is it you do what you do? So it used to be that when you couldn't explain what your advertising did, you're like, well, this one is branding. Another thing I talk a lot about is short-termism versus long-termism. I'm agnostic on both, but you just have to find the balance. What is it you want to achieve now? And don't think that if, for example, you get into a massive sponsorship, you don't want to measure the performance, the effectiveness of that with short-term metrics, because those things tend to need to percolate in a lot of brains for a lot longer in order to really achieve their full effect. So infinite amount of really interesting conversations to be had on that, I think.
What also happened in the crisis, and again, I have a very American-centric view, I'd love to hear your perspective, is digital tools were relied on a lot more. Not necessarily in marketing, but overall. The commerce tools got to the forefront. Analytics had a bigger role because nobody really knew what was happening in the market, and they wanted to get better data and better understanding. Are there shifts you're seeing in general in marketing that changed during the crisis, and you think these are some trends that are staying, or some of this could be just temporary displacement?
First of all, there's a couple of conversations to be had within that space, but so one is what happens to your marketing budget, and the other one is what is the distribution of those investments on the various communication channels. That there's a skew towards digital, which is kind of natural if you size down a large marketing budget, you're going a bit towards the shorter term wins. So I don't necessarily blame anyone for that. So yeah, I mean the different sectors had very different possibilities and required actions. I mean, some were an absolute existential crisis. I mean, as a restaurant, obviously you wouldn't be advertising. Well, I would say obviously you're probably focused on somehow staying afloat. If you're operating a cruise line, you can apply different strategies, but I doubt that you would be at full speed in terms of your marketing investments for a while there, at least early in the year. So yeah, and our category was bifurcated a bit because, as I said, we have online sports betting. The underlying product disappeared for a while with the leagues naturally shutting down. But on the other hand, you had the casino, which is a completely aside from live casino, is still a completely digital product. So two different kind of scenarios there. But so if you're in a very well-funded company in this particular crisis, and you have no particular cash flow issues, it was actually an interesting opportunity potentially to at least maintain your spend budgets or even increase them, because in the big picture, in the long run, what you see is share of market tends to equal share of voice. Share of voice is a bit more difficult to measure these days with the vast undergrowth of digital. But in essence, in order to achieve 10% market share, all things being equal, same level of creative and so on, you should aim for 10% share of voice. However, if you want to grow, the way to go would be to over-index on your share of voice. You have 15% share of voice, in order to slowly build that. And there are pretty good case stories on that. Obviously, it depends a lot. It's almost, what do you call it, game theory, in that it depends a bit on what all the other actors do. But that's kind of the theory around it. So for certain companies, if they have a really well-informed marketing and finance team, it would have been an opportunity to actually increase your spend, because not only are other advertisers going off air, you're probably getting more bang for your buck, but odds are probably that your competitors will not be fully comfortable with this strategy. So that can really pay off in terms of getting kind of brand equity for a cut rate price for a while. But I mean, obviously, you're betting on a crisis that you don't really know how long it's going to be. So at this stage, I would say that's a pretty risky one. But that's kind of the range. But probably the norm would be that you pull your feelers back a bit and spend a bit less, because it was a major unknown, and it still is to a certain extent. But what the crisis has also been for, I mean, which company hasn't been impacted, right? For a lot of us, has been a forced experiment in many ways, and so I see it both from an organizational perspective, like corporations, but also at a in consumer level. I think it's been an opportunity, or a forced opportunity, to try new things. So in terms of what you're mentioning, various digital ad platforms or new vehicles, it could have been an opportunity for companies to try something new there, because now there was a reason to do it and kind of move away from the traditional stuff. In the same way that this crisis has pulled people over towards digital simply because it was a lot more resilient. So as we all know, Amazon obviously was a go-to in order to get your food through Whole Foods or whatever it is. You forced certain consumer segments to try something that they wouldn't have done before, and of course existing customers dialed up their expenditure. But my thesis is that once hopefully everything goes back to more or less normal, I would argue that people are creatures of habit, and they kind of go back to somewhere around where they more or less was, like a little bit more advanced. But my point with that is, I don't think it's kind of a radical change event. For certain areas it might be, but I think it's a customer acquisition event in certain areas. So let's say maybe Amazon didn't have as much penetration in elderly segments as a thesis. Now that kind of conversion hurdle, they're like, I don't know how this works. I don't want to deal with it. No offense against anyone, but whoever the segment is, we know that there are still some out there that never really tried it, and they're like, fine, this actually looks like it could solve my problem now. So they put the effort towards actually opening an account and trying it out, and now they're like, well, that actually kind of works okay. So that particular customer cohort is probably much more likely to keep going afterwards, and that's a cohort that didn't exist before. And I think that's probably true as well from certain B2B companies buying advertising. Trying a few new things there, or maybe realizing they really need to up their productivity because bottom line looks pretty shifty for a while. How much of this can we automate? Actually, another industry I read about, so way out of my expertise, but I thought it was pretty interesting from this perspective, is trade finance, kind of the shadowy industry that most people don't really notice, I guess. But so that's essentially when a factory makes 1,000 pairs of shoes in Portugal, and they sell them to a retail store in the UK. They probably have 90 days credit, and the factory runs a risk on that payment to a certain extent. Now, there's a whole industry that specializes in kind of insurance or financing around those, and that whole thing got ground to a halt because, as you can imagine, it is heavily dependent on paper. Very old-fashioned, the whole thing. I guess there's never really much of an impetus to change things up much. As I understand it, this was from an Economist article. More than, like, the average transaction for kind of includes more than 30 instances of paper that adds up to around 240 copies. All of this being locked in various offices now that the supply chain shut down. And there was really interesting indicators that various settlement courts or whatever they are, various instances suddenly move very rapidly to accept digital signatures and digital invoices, what have you, all the various components. So that was probably like a real accelerator moment where the risk profile of companies changed. Like, it's too big risk to send everyone home and decentralize the organization entirely. I mean, theoretically, it kind of works for some of our tech people, maybe. But now, as it happens, a lot of companies ended up doing that. And so that was a forced experiment, and now we have data on how that worked. You can look back upon, you have anecdotes on it. So I think it's not necessarily radical change, but I think it was an accelerator. It's one of the things that should concern anyone who does digital advertising, is that there's a lot more scope for fraud within those products. Not at all naming any names, but the advantage of some of the existing long-standing vehicles, like TV, for example, is that delivery is pretty certain. You know pretty much how many people are going to see this. And that's something to really keep an eye on in terms of digital advertising. When you're told 1 million people saw this, how sure can you really be about that? And how large a piece of the screen that they see, that they hear the audio, all those things. It becomes really complicated to get into all those things. So yeah, asking about digital advertising brings up a lot of conversations.
Wow, we covered a lot of ground, Thomas, today. I want to thank you for your time, and there is, I think, hopefully we share the hope that we're going to come out strong, and I do believe that marketing and sales obviously will lead the way out of any crisis, and some of the tools will be helpful. But I really like your perspective on connecting the various ways of marketing to the actual value they create, and judging and stack ranking based on that. So thanks for your time today.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Thomas.